What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Fight Scene. This is my YouTube channel where I go over all things MMA, and today I want to talk a little bit about UFC 222, which is going down this Saturday, March 3rd at T-Mobile Arena. I took a little while to put up this video. I want to get my videos up about the events as soon as possible, but I just found myself really procrastinating putting up this video. I said the same thing about the I think Francis Ngannou card. The challenge is that my interest in the UFC in particular has kind of slowed down over the past number of weeks, and I've been watching MMA for a long time. It's not that I was a fair weather fan and now I'm getting out of it. I've watched it for since about 2004, and I've really enjoyed the sport, but for some reason right now I'm just not getting as into it as much as I want to. And I was talking to a friend about this, and he was saying that, you know, it's just that oversaturation of the sport really has kind of affected me. And the thing is that there haven't been a lot of really great fights the past little while. It's not just because Conor McGregor is gone or John Jones is gone or Ronda's gone. It's not the lack of big stars. It's just right now they are putting out cards that aren't as good as we've seen from the UFC in the past. So for example, this past Fox card was pretty good. I enjoyed. I mean, the fights were fantastic, but from a name value this past Saturday, it just wasn't what we're used to seeing as far as a Fox card goes. Jeremy Stevens headlined the event, but remember the first set of Fox cards? It was Benson Henderson versus Nate Diaz, and the very first Fox card was the heavyweight title of Kane versus Junior Dos Santos. So, you know, we're just not seeing the same output as far as headliners and a solid undercard from the UFC. What their strategy seems to be right now is put out as many cards as possible, because while, you know, there might not be as many just ginormous cards, they can get the revenue by putting out a lot of cards that are a bit more watered down. And so I've just been finding that I'm not as into it as I would like to be. And so, you know, I'm not really getting the videos out that I had really hoped. I'm hoping that changes come July as we look at Stipe Miocic versus Daniel Cormier and some other big fights. In the summer, July card is usually pretty big, and then we see some good cards in the summer and then right into the fall. So I'm hoping that changes up. And I was originally really excited for UFC 222. I think Max Holloway versus Frankie Edgar is the best fight that you can make at featherweight right now. It's the fight I've wanted to see for a really long time, and I was really pumped up to see that fight. When it turned out that Max Holloway got injured, I was really disappointed, because I think that's the best fight they can make. And so, you know, it is what it is. Injuries happen, and we have a fairly decent card still on Saturday. It's not the best card I've ever seen. It's not the worst card I've ever seen. There's some good names on there. We have I'm gonna go through some of the fights pretty quickly. I'd like to spend most of my time talking about Frankie Edgar versus Brian Ortega, because we have the women's featherweight title on the line with Chris Cyborg, and I'm not even really going to go into that fight. It's going to be a demolition by Cyborg. There's nobody that can even come close to competing with her. I really hope they set up that Amanda Nunes fight as soon as possible, because it's the only featherweight women's fight that has any interest at this point. I would watch a rematch with Holly Holm, but outside of that, they really need to figure something out for this women's featherweight division, because it's just Cyborg walking through people. And hey, you know, I mean, I'll watch it. I'll enjoy watching it, kinda. And you know, they could keep doing that, and they'll get my money. But I'd like to see them come up with something a little bit more competitive, and Amanda Nunes is the way to do that. You also have Sean O'Malley on the card. He was on that Dana White Tuesday Night Contender Series, and he's a bit of a name. He's a promising kid that I think has a flashy style, and I'm a little bit surprised to see him as high on the card as he is, but he will win this fight, no problem. I think they're trying to build him up, and they've given him somebody that should be a fairly easy matchup for him. No offense to Andre, but I think Sean O'Malley wins this fight pretty handily. And then, you know, you have a good heavyweight fight of Stefan Struve versus Andrei Arlovski. This was a tough one to call. Both these fighters have had their ups and downs over the years in the UFC. Andrei Arlovski, a true veteran in the sport, he's on his way out. I'm sure even he would say that. Andrei Arlovski was one of the first. Andrei Arlovski versus Tim Sylvia was probably the first pay-per-view event that I went out to a bar to watch. And I remember just loving it. And I remember the pizza that I ate. I tried to get it again. They took it off the menu. And, you know, everything about that is just has nostalgic vibes for me. And so I'm really pulling for Andre, but I have a feeling like Stefan Struve's reach will really be the story of this fight, and I'm hoping that Andre doesn't get knocked out. People say that he's a bit chinny, and I'm not going to go into what I think that is. He's taken a lot of damage over his career, but I just think that Stefan's reach is probably going to pose problems for Andre. So if I was a betting man, I would probably put my money on Stefan Struve. Not that he hasn't had his health issues himself, but I think Stefan Struve is probably more likely going to win that fight. And then we have Kat Zingano versus Ketlin Vieira. And I actually don't know a lot about Ketlin. I'll be honest. I don't follow women's MMA too much. But I do know a little bit about Kat Zingano, and my MMA spidey sense is telling me that she's going to lose this fight. Kat Zingano is a fantastic fighter, but she's had some really tough challenges in her personal life, and she's taken a long layoff, and she's back again, and she's taken a couple of long layoffs, and I just don't think this is going to be her night. I know skill-wise, on paper, there's no reason why she should lose this fight, but something tells me I feel like I've seen this story before, and I think Kat Zingano probably loses this fight. There's some other fights on the card. I think Mike Pyle wins his fight. Brian Caraway wins his fight. And then there's a good fight between CB Dollaway and Hector Lombard. Hector Lombard in the UFC has been a little bit underwhelming. I think we all expected bigger things from him. And this is an interesting fight. He's back at middleweight after a small stint at welterweight. And, it's a tough fight to pick, but I would probably lean Hector Lombard in this fight. No, I would lean Hector Lombard. CB Dollaway is a great fighter, and I think there's a lot of reasons why people could pick him, but maybe I'm just going off a lot of intuition today, but something tells me Hector wins that fight. And so anyway, those are just some opinions that they're not based on a lot, but I thought I'd throw out there for you to see what my picks are for the card. But I really want to spend some time talking about Frankie Edgar versus Brian Ortega. This is the fight of the card. Not necessarily that it's going to be a flashy fight, but it is the most meaningful fight on this card by far. And I'll just get it out. I'll get my bias right up front. I think Frankie Edgar is the best featherweight on the planet. So I'll say that again because I'll let it sink in for a minute. I believe that Frankie Edgar is the best featherweight on the planet. If I was talking about Frankie versus Max Holloway, I would be picking Frankie in that fight. I think that Frankie also beats Conor McGregor in a fight. I'm a big Conor McGregor fan, but I think Frankie Edgar is the most skilled fighter at the featherweight division. He's the best boxer in the featherweight division. And I think that he is just the best in the UFC, and by nature of the UFC being the best organization in the world, I think he's the best featherweight on the planet. And so I listened to a lot of breakdowns on Edgar versus Ortega, and a lot of them will just tell you that Frankie Edgar is the more skilled fighter. There's a really good one by Robin Black, who I listen to a lot because he does think outside the box. He does go a little bit too far for my liking sometimes. And, he's basically saying, is it possible for Brian Ortega to sort of hack the matrix a little bit and though he might not be as good of a wrestler as Frankie Edgar, he might be able to use his transitions to kind of catch Frankie with something that we wouldn't necessarily call wrestling, but is enough to get the job done. I'm going to talk about 3 specific things really quickly to give you an idea of why I think Frankie Edgar will win this fight and why I think he will likely move on to a fight against Max Holloway and win that fight as well. First of all, Frankie Edgar simply has more experience than Brian Ortega. And I would spend more time talking about this because I think it's a really important concept. And I'll probably make a video entirely on this concept. But what I've seen over the years watching MMA is that fighters that have been in that spotlight before, that's a skill, right? Conor and people talk about doing press being a skill. But for somebody to be in that big spotlight fight, like Brian Ortega, this is the biggest fight of his career. Sometimes that pressure can dwarf somebody, and I often give the edge in a fight to the champion. If all skills were considered equal, I would give the edge to the champion, not because the judges will score it better for the champion, but because they've been there before. They've been in the spotlight. They've answered the questions. They've done the grind, which is a trillion interviews leading up to the fight. And it doesn't wear on them physically. I literally mean physically, not just mentally, but it doesn't wear on them physically as much because they've been there before. And Frankie's been fighting massive fights for as long as I can remember. Since his fights with BJ Penn and even before then, he has been, every time he fights, it's a big deal. So he is used to fight week. And I think that's something that Brian Ortega might get used to, but he's not there yet. And so maybe I'll make a video one day unpacking that concept a little bit more. But I think realistically, Frankie just has more experience in big fights, and that will potentially give him a slight edge in this fight. On top of that, I think that Frankie has better sparring partners than Brian Ortega. And I don't want to diminish Brian's camps and the people that he works with in any way. You know, he trains with Henner Gracie at the Gracie Academy, and his jiu-jitsu is second to none. Don't get me wrong. But Frankie Edgar trains with Ricardo Almeida. And that, you know, there's nothing really that Brian Ortega is going to do to Frankie that his jiu-jitsu coach hasn't already shown him. And so I think that not only is Frankie the better wrestler, I think that's pretty obvious that Frankie is a better wrestler in this fight, but he is more skilled because he has better sparring partners. We're talking about Edson Barbosa. We're talking about Ricardo Almeida. Mark Henry as a head coach. He trains with Chris Weidman at Renzo Gracie Academy in New York. He has a group of fighters that can really push him harder than what I think Brian Ortega has. And I said that in my last breakdown video as well, because iron sharpens iron. The training partners is what I really think pushes people to become better and be in that fire all the time and just dealing with pressure and just learning and getting better in spite of having really, really skilled people throwing things at you every day. And so I think that that will potentially give Frankie Edgar the win. And then my last point here that I've written down is that Frankie Edgar is simply more skilled than Brian Ortega. Brian has better jiu-jitsu, no doubt, but Frankie's wrestling is quite strong. His jiu-jitsu is very good himself. Like I said, he has Ricardo Almeida, which is a high level black belt. And so Frankie's no slouch on the mat. He knows how to deal with jiu-jitsu. He knows how to defend against attacks on the ground. He is by far the better boxer. He is the better wrestler. He's going to be better in scrambles. And, you know, maybe youth isn't on his side. Brian's a lot younger. And Brian, I think, is a lot bigger than Frankie. I'd have to maybe look into that. But Brian Ortega is a really, really big featherweight. And so he might be bigger than Frankie. That would be one thing that Brian can maybe use to his advantage. But realistically, I think Frankie beats him in every area unless Brian figures out a way to put him on his back. And even then, I believe that Frankie would use his knowledge of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to stand right back up, get up, and outbox him. And Frankie is an impeccable boxer. And so I think he wins this fight. I think he wins it by decision because that's sort of Frankie's style. He's a stick and move point kind of, get you with boxing. It's not that he doesn't have knockout power. It's just that I don't see him knocking out Brian Ortega. I certainly don't see him submitting Brian Ortega. And so I think it's most likely that Frankie wins this fight by decision. But don't kid yourself. I think Brian Ortega is fantastic, and a win over him really just shows how good Frankie Edgar is. And in my opinion, really, he is the best featherweight on the planet. I think he beats Max Holloway. I think he beats Conor McGregor in a fight. I think he's a bad matchup for Conor. Really bad matchup for Conor, to be honest. I'd love to see that fight more than anything. That's the one I'd always wanted to see, as big of a Conor fan as I am. But I think Frankie beats him. And the only knock on him is that he can't seem to beat Jose Aldo. And, you know, it is what it is. Apparently, Jose's a bad matchup for Frankie. I'd be interested to see Frankie in a third fight against Jose now that Max has kind of cracked the code a little bit. But I think Frankie, pound for pound or skill for skill or whatever the heck you want to call it, is the best #1 featherweight on the planet. And so I think he takes this fight pretty handily. Anyway, those are my opinions on the fights coming up this Saturday at UFC 222. If you look to the right here, you'll see a couple other videos that I put up that you might enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.